This is Geometry, Unit 9, Day number 1. We're going to find and use the slopes of lines. The whole concept of slope you've done many times over the last several years of your math. Slope is considered rise over run. Rising is going up or down, that's your vertical. Running is going right and left, that's your horizontal. So the slope formula is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. When we think about slopes, slope that increases to the right, we always consider these to be going to the right. When it increases to the right, it's positive. When it decreases to the right, it's negative. When it's horizontal, flat like the floor, that's considered a zero slope. And when it's vertical, going straight up and down like a wall, that would be considered undefined. We'll experience each of these as we go through. So here, we're going to talk about the slope from A to B as a rise over run. So here we have our line A to B. So we're going to calculate from the A down and then over to the B. So notice that the scale is 2. So we're going over, so each line is worth 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then for the x, it's 1. So it's 9 down, so that's negative 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 4 to the right. So that's a positive 4. So our slope would be negative 9 over 4. From A to B, we see that the vertical, the rising, is 0. It's on the same y value as letter B. So that's 0. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 4 units on the run. It wouldn't matter if it was 4, negative 8, or 22. This would always come out to be a 0 slope because the numerator is 0, the denominator is not a 0, therefore you will get a 0. Here, for examples number 2, we're going to use the slope formula. Notice that it's y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. It is okay if you said y1 minus y2, x1 minus x2. You can be consistent that way. That wouldn't matter. You just have to put the y on top, the rising, which is the y-axis, the y variables. So let's label our points. x1, y1, x2, y2, 5 minus 1, 1 minus a negative 7, 4, 1 plus 7, so that reduces down to a half. So the slope between these 2 points would be rise up 1 over 2, rise up 1 over 2. Here again we have our x1, y1, x2, y2, 9 minus 3, 4 minus 4. That gives us some number over 0. It wouldn't matter what number's on top. It just matters that there's a 0 on bottom. If there's a 0 on bottom, it's considered undefined. That's telling us that this is a vertical slope. If you do a quick sketch of the points, over 4 up 3, over 4 up 9, you'll see that those points are vertical to each other. That's considered undefined because the slope goes straight up and down. Just like the note said up here, that we'd have a 0 slope if it was horizontal like we did for B, and it's undefined if we have a vertical slope like we did for example 2B. For example 3, 2 people go outside to exercise. Find the rate at which each person exercised in miles per minute. So we'll look here. Person A had 4 miles. in 20 minutes. So that's 4 over 20. We can reduce that down to 1/5. So 1 mile in 5 minutes. That's person A. Person B, they did 2 miles in 40 minutes, and we can reduce that down to 1/20. Now when we look at these fractions, we see that the 2 is larger than the 5, but the 1/5 is more, or is a larger value than 1 out of 20. If you were to have 1/20 of the piece of cake, or if you were going to have 1/5 of the piece of cake, 1/5 is much bigger. It's about 20%. 1/20 is about 5%. So, larger slope. What is the relationship between these rates and the slopes of the segments? Person A has a faster rate. The 1/5 is a larger number than 1/20, so it's considered a faster rate. Therefore, their slope is greater. So we're going to compare the rates and the slopes. So if it's a faster or a larger number, that gives you a faster rate. Therefore, their slope is greater. Person B has a smaller ratio. So a slower rate. Therefore, we can also use 3 dots in mathematics represents the term therefore. Therefore, their slope is less. Not greater, but less. Less than A, really. What does the slope of the segments tell you about each person? Well, we know that since person A has a larger ratio, their slope is greater. And therefore, moving faster than person B during exercise. On the other side, we're looking at what do slopes look like if 2 lines are parallel. 2 lines are parallel if and only if their slopes are equal. So if their slopes have the same number, then those 2 would be considered parallel to each other. If they're both going up 1 over 2, then they're never going to intersect. They'll be parallel. If two lines are perpendicular, or two lines are perpendicular if and only if their slopes are negative reciprocals. Another way to phrase that is to call them opposite reciprocals. So negative, or the word opposite, means that their sign's going to change. One of the lines is going to have a positive slope, one of the lines is going to have a negative slope. That's the only way that you can have perpendicular. You could have a vertical, which is an undefined, and a zero. Those would also be considered perpendicular. Reciprocals are when the fraction is flipped upside down. So let's check and see what happens here. We have line 1 and line 2. We know our equation for slope is y2 minus y1, x2 minus x1. Always try to write the equation at least once on your sheet for every group of questions that you're doing. So here's our x1, y1, x2, y2. So the slope for number 1 is 4 minus 0 and 7 minus 1. That's 4/6, which can be reduced to 2/3. Slope number 2 becomes 9 minus 0 and 3 minus 9. That's 9 over negative 6. Divide that by 3, divide that by 3. So this becomes a negative fraction, 3/2. So notice that it's a reciprocal, 3 on top, 2 on bottom, 2 on top, 3 on bottom. So they're reciprocals of each other, and their sign is different. This fraction is positive, they're both positive. This fraction, it's negative because one of them is negative. So we know that line 1 is perpendicular, or slope 1 is perpendicular to slope 2. Slopes themselves aren't perpendicular, but the lines would be. The line is perpendicular to the other. The slope of line number 1 would be negative 2 minus 1, negative 7 minus a negative 3. If you have the top and the bottom that are negative, that turns it into a positive. This becomes a negative plus 1. 4 minus a negative, which is 4 plus 1, which is 5. 8 minus 2, which is 6. These are different, so the lines intersect. It would fall under neither, because our lines intersect. That's neither comma, the lines intersect. Here we have slope number 1 would be 5 minus 4 over 10 minus 7. That would become 1/3. Slope number 2 is 5 minus 3 over 8 minus 2. 2/6, which can be reduced down to 1/3. These are the same, so the lines are parallel. Slope 1 is parallel, is really be considered line 1 is parallel to line 2. The slopes are the same, therefore the lines are parallel.